My name is Ethan Parker. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've lived on the edges of attention rather than at the center of it. I've never been the loud one in the room, never the person who pushes forward to be seen or heard. I work a stable job, keep my head down, and do what I say I'm going to do. To most people, that makes me dependable, but also forgettable. People tend to underestimate me. Not out of cruelty, usually, but out of habit. They assume that because I don't interrupt, I don't have strong opinions. Because I don't react quickly, I must not notice much. Silence, in their minds, equals absence. And for a long time, I didn't challenge that assumption. I thought it was safer to let people think whatever they wanted as long as I knew who I was. This story is about the moment I realized that assumption had become dangerous. The person at the center of it, whether I like it or not, is my brother. Someone who shared my childhood, my history, my last name. Someone I trusted, not because he earned it every day, but because trust felt automatic between us. I didn't see him as a threat. I didn't even see him as a variable. What follows isn't a story about explosive arguments or dramatic betrayals. It's quieter than that. It's about how reputations are shaped in side conversations, in jokes that land a little too well, in narratives repeated just often enough that they start to feel like facts. It's about how, over time, other people began reacting to me differently, hesitating, doubting, filling in gaps I didn't know existed. For a long time, I assumed the problem was me, that I needed to explain myself better, be more open, more visible. I told myself that family conflicts are normal, that misunderstandings resolve themselves if you stay calm and reasonable. I believed that if I didn't escalate, nothing would escalate around me. I was wrong. This story isn't about revenge. There's no public takedown, no shouting match, no moment where everyone suddenly realizes the truth and applauds. That kind of ending is satisfying, but it isn't real. What this is about is something slower and more unsettling, recognizing that someone else has been quietly defining you in rooms you're not in, and deciding what to do once you see it clearly. I'm sharing this not to position myself as a victim, and not to paint my brother as a villain. It's more complicated than that. It's about awareness, restraint, and choosing a response that aligns with who you want to be, not who you're being pushed to become. If you've ever felt invisible in a way that slowly started to feel intentional, if you've ever sensed that your silence was being interpreted as permission, then this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something, quietly, without judgment. Have you ever realized that someone else was shaping your reputation while you were busy trying to keep the peace? For most of my life, I was the easy one to define, not because I fit neatly into a box, but because people rarely bothered to look closely enough to see anything complicated. I was the younger brother who didn't cause trouble, the one who didn't demand attention at family gatherings, the one who listened more than he spoke and left early without making a scene. In professional settings, I was seen the same way. Reliable, calm, useful, someone who would pick up the slack quietly and never make it awkward. When projects went smoothly, no one mentioned my name. When something needed fixing at the last minute, I was the person they called, usually with the assumption that I'd say yes. And I did. Not because I lacked boundaries, but because I believed consistency mattered. I believed showing up mattered. I believed that if you did good work long enough, people would eventually see you clearly. At home, within my family, the contrast was sharper. My brother had presence. He spoke with confidence, even when he wasn't entirely sure. He filled the silence instinctively. People leaned toward him in conversations, waiting for his reactions before forming their own. It wasn't manipulation, at least not at first. It was charisma, practiced over time. Next to him, I became background. Not ignored exactly, more like pre-understood. People thought they already knew who I was, so they stopped asking. If there was a disagreement, I was assumed to be neutral. If there was tension, I was expected to absorb it quietly. I became the stable surface others could lean on without worrying it might move. What's strange is that I didn't resent this role at the beginning. There's a kind of comfort in being underestimated. Expectations are low. Pressure is minimal. You're rarely blamed for outcomes because no one imagines you're steering anything. I told myself that being unseen was a form of freedom. But invisibility isn't neutral. It shapes how people talk about you when you're not there. It shapes what they believe is possible from you. Over time, it narrows the version of you that exists in their minds until any deviation feels suspicious. I noticed it first in small ways. A pause before someone agreed with me, as if waiting for confirmation elsewhere. A joke was made at my expense that landed a little too comfortably. Decisions are being finalized without me, even when they affect my work directly. None of it was aggressive. None of it felt intentional enough to call out. And that was the problem, because when something isn't obviously wrong, you start assuming it must be acceptable. Within my family, the pattern was clearer but harder to confront. My brother spoke for me often, summarizing my thoughts, explaining my intentions, framing my actions. People nodded along. It saved time. It made things efficient. And because I didn't interrupt him, it became normal. He doesn't really care about that stuff, he'd say casually. He's more laid back than he looks. He's not the type to push back. None of those statements was an outright lie. They were just incomplete, carefully trimmed versions of the truth that left out depth, agency, and intent. And because I stayed quiet, they stuck. I wasn't invisible because I lacked substance. I was invisible because I didn't correct the narrative early enough. I trusted that proximity equaled understanding, that shared history protected accuracy, that family wouldn't reduce you for convenience. I didn't yet understand how roles form, not through declarations, but through repetition. Every time I didn't clarify, someone else did it for me. Every time I let a comment pass, it became a data point. Every time I chose peace over precision, I paid for it later. Still, I didn't see any of this as a threat. At that stage, I believed that being underestimated was temporary, that eventually circumstances would reveal what words hadn't. I thought patience was a virtue that always paid interest. What I didn't know yet was that while I was waiting, a version of me was solidifying in other people's minds. Quiet, limited, non-threatening. And once a reputation hardens, it doesn't crack easily. Not even when it's wrong. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it didn't feel important enough to name. That's how these things usually begin. Not with a wound, but with a sensation. A slight pressure. A moment that passes too quickly to stop, but lingers long enough to return later, uninvited. We were at a small family dinner. Nothing formal, just conversation drifting between dikes. Plates being passed, familiar routines replaying themselves. At some point, the discussion turned to work. Who was busy, who was stressed, who was doing well. Someone asked me a direct question. I started to answer. My brother cut in halfway through my first sentence. Not aggressively, not rudely, just smoothly, as if he were helping me along. He's been kind of stuck lately, he said with a light laugh. You know how he is, comfortable where he's at. The table nodded. Someone smiled. The conversation moved on. No one looked at me for confirmation. I remember opening my mouth to correct it, then closing it again. The moment had already passed. Interrupting would have felt awkward, defensive, and unnecessary. I told myself it wasn't worth making a scene over a single sentence, but something in me took note, because stuck wasn't accurate. I wasn't struggling. I wasn't lost. I had made deliberate choices about my pace and my direction, but the way he said it reframed those choices into inertia, and because it came from him, it sounded authoritative. That night, I replayed the moment more than I wanted to admit, not because it hurt, exactly, but because it didn't. It slid in too easily. No resistance, no friction. That's what unsettled me. If a comment can change how people see you without causing discomfort, it's far more dangerous than open criticism. I started noticing similar moments after that. Small comments framed as observations. Jokes that subtly reduced my agency. Stories retold with my role, softened, simplified, edited down. Always delivered casually. Always in social spaces where correcting the record would feel disproportionate. And every time I stayed quiet. Part of me believed that speaking up would make me look insecure. Another part believed that people who knew me well would see through it anyway. I underestimated how much weight repetition carries when it comes from the right voice. The thing about subtle disrespect is that it gives you plausible deniability, both to others and to yourself. If I confronted him, what would I even say? That comment bothered me. That tone felt dismissive. He could easily deny it, laugh it off, accuse me of overthinking, and maybe he wouldn't even be lying. Intent is slippery that way. So I did what felt mature. I let it go, but I didn't forget it. I began to notice how people reacted to me after those moments. Questions framed differently, expectations lowered, invitations phrased as afterthoughts. It wasn't dramatic, it was cumulative. And the most unsettling part, my brother never repeated the same line twice. Each comment was unique, context-specific, impossible to isolate without sounding paranoid. But together they formed a pattern, one I was the only person close enough, quiet enough to see. I hadn't yet seen it as an attack. I saw it as misalignment, miscommunication, something that would correct itself if I just stayed consistent long enough. I still believed that clarity eventually rises to the surface on its own. What I didn't realize was that narratives don't need to be loud to be effective. They just need to be early and uncontested. That first small cut didn't draw blood, but it marked a place where something could enter. And once it did, it didn't need permission to stay. After that first moment, nothing changed. At least not in a way anyone else could point to. There were no arguments, no cold shoulders, no obvious escalation. Life continued in the same rhythms it always had. And that was exactly what made it so easy to doubt my own perception. Because when disrespect arrives quietly and leaves no visible damage, it's tempting to treat it like background noise. The comments continued, spaced far enough apart that each one felt isolated. A remark here, a reframing there, always delivered casually, often with a smile. If anyone else noticed, they didn't show it. And I never gave them a reason to. I told myself I was being too sensitive. After all, my brother had always been more expressive than I, more comfortable speaking on behalf of others. That didn't automatically make it malicious. Families have dynamics, roles, patterns that form early and are rarely get questioned. So I adjusted. I laughed when the jokes landed in my direction. I nodded when my decisions were summarized for me. I accepted when people made assumptions that weren't quite accurate, but close enough to avoid correction. I convinced myself that correcting every small thing would make me look pedantic, or worse, defensive. Silence felt cleaner, but silence also trained people. It taught them what they could say without consequence. It taught them whose version of events would stand. It taught them that I wouldn't contest the narrative. The most difficult part wasn't the comments themselves. It was how quickly they became normal. At gatherings, people started turning to my brother when asking about my plans. At work, adjacent conversations, his interpretations of my choices carried more weight than my own explanations. I became someone whose inner world was explained externally, and because I didn't push back, it started to feel natural to everyone except me. I noticed how people phrased things around me. You're probably fine with whatever. You don't strike me as someone who'd care about that. You're easygoing, right? None of these were insults, but they boxed me in, reduced me to a temperament rather than a person with intent. And still, I stayed quiet. Not because I agreed, but because I believed patience was strength. I believed that composure would eventually speak louder than clarification. I believed that if I maintained my integrity, the truth would surface without force. There was also fear beneath that belief. Fear that if I spoke up, I'd be told I was imagining things, that I'd be accused of reading too much into harmless comments, that I'd fracture relationships over something intangible, something I couldn't easily prove. So I chose restraint. I told myself I was choosing peace, but what I was really choosing was familiarity. It's easier to tolerate a slow erosion than to confront the possibility that someone close to you is contributing to it, intentionally or not. It's easier to accept a diminished version of yourself than to risk being seen as difficult. Over time, I noticed a shift in how I saw myself too. I started simplifying my own explanations. I spoke less, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned it wouldn't land cleanly anyway. I adjusted my tone to match expectations. I became more predictable, more contained. Not because that's who I was, but because it was easier than constant correction. That's how normalization works. It doesn't require agreement, just repetition and compliance. By the time I realized how far it had gone, the disrespect didn't feel like an intrusion anymore. It felt like part of the environment, something you work around instead of a challenge. And that's when it becomes most dangerous. Because once something feels normal, you stop questioning it, you stop tracking its impact, you stop imagining alternatives. I hadn't yet reached the breaking point, but I was getting closer to something else. An awareness that silence wasn't neutral and patience wasn't protecting me the way I thought it was. I just hadn't admitted it to myself yet. I didn't wake up one day suddenly aware of the role I'd been placed into. It came together gradually, like an image sharpening into focus once you stop pretending the blur is temporary. The moment of clarity wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and uncomfortable because it required me to admit something I'd been avoiding. People weren't misunderstanding me. They were understanding me exactly as I had allowed myself to be presented. The role was simple. I was the dependable one, the one who didn't complicate things, the one who absorbed tension so others didn't have to. In group settings, I was expected to agree or defer. At work-related conversations, I was the person who would handle it without needing recognition. Within my family, I was the stabilizer, the emotional buffer between stronger personalities. And buffers aren't meant to be seen. They're meant to function. Once I recognized that, I started noticing how consistently the role was reinforced. When decisions were being made, my input was welcomed only after it was framed by someone else. When opinions differed, mine was treated as optional. When something went wrong, I was expected to smooth it over quietly, without disturbing the broader dynamic. No one asked me if I wanted this role, but everyone relied on me to maintain it. The most telling moments were the ones where I didn't comply. If I hesitated, people seemed confused. If I expressed a preference, it was treated like an exception. If I pushed back, even gently, it felt as though I'd broken an unspoken agreement. I wasn't being punished. I was being corrected. And my brother, whether consciously or not, acted as the enforcer of that correction. He didn't need to be aggressive. All he had to do was reframe my actions in a way that restored equilibrium. He's just tired. He didn't mean it that way. That's not really his thing. Each comment guided perception back into place. What troubled me most was how functional the system was. No one was acting out of malice. The dynamic served everyone else. My silence kept things smooth. My predictability made planning easier. My lack of resistance reduced friction. From the outside, it probably looked healthy. From the inside, it felt constricting. I realized that the role I'd been assigned didn't require me to fail. It required me to stay manageable, to be competent but not commanding, present but not influential, trustworthy but not authoritative. That distinction matters because once you occupy that space, your reputation becomes fragile in a very specific way. You're valued for what you provide, not for who you are. And if someone chooses to redefine what you provide or question its value, you don't have much room to counter. I had been protecting harmony at the cost of self-definition. And harmony, I was learning, often benefits the loudest voices first. This realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I stopped asking myself whether the role was fair. I started asking myself whether it was accurate and whether I was willing to keep maintaining it. I understood then that waiting for the role to change on its own was unrealistic. Roles persist because they're useful. They dissolve only when someone stops performing them. And that creates discomfort. Not conflict, discomfort. The kind people don't notice immediately, but feel nonetheless. I didn't act on this understanding right away. I wasn't ready to. Awareness came before action, observation before disruption. But once I saw the role clearly, I couldn't unsee it. And for the first time, I began to consider a possibility I had avoided for years. That staying quiet wasn't keeping the peace. It was preserving a version of me that others found convenient. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no dramatic realization punctuated by anger. In fact, nothing outward changed at all. The moment that altered everything looked insignificant from the outside. One of those ordinary moments that wouldn't register in anyone else's memory. But it stayed with me. It happened on a weekday evening, after work. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, laptop open, documents spread out in front of me. I had been reviewing notes from a project. Nothing urgent, just tying up loose ends the way I always did. Methodical, quiet, unnoticed. A message came in from my brother. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't even direct. He was asking for help. Again. A small favor, something he needed me to take a look at because I was better with details. The wording was familiar, casual, almost affectionate. I stared at the message longer than necessary, not because I didn't know how to respond, but because I realized how automatic my response had become. I could feel my body preparing to say yes before my mind had even decided. The role is activating itself. That's when something inside me paused, not resisted, paused. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel hurt. What I felt was distance, like stepping half a pace back from a scene I had been inside for years. For the first time, I wasn't inside the interaction. I was observing it. I noticed how often help only flowed in one direction, how my reliability had become assumed, how my time was treated as flexible by default. And I noticed something else, quieter but more important. I had been more careful with other people's boundaries than my own. That realization landed without drama. It didn't accuse anyone. It didn't rewrite the past. It simply clarified the present. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I closed the laptop and sat there in silence. Not avoidance, reflection. I thought about how many times I had stepped in to fix things that weren't mine. How often I had allowed my competence to substitute for consent. I realized that the issue wasn't that others misunderstood me. It was that I had been over-available. And availability, unchecked, turns into entitlement. That night, I didn't make a declaration. I didn't plan a confrontation. I didn't even fully articulate what I would do differently. I just decided on one thing. I would stop reacting automatically. That was it. No strategy, no endgame. Just a commitment to interrupt the pattern internally before it plays out externally. When I finally replied to my brother, my message was neutral, polite, brief. I can look at it later this week. I'll let you know. No explanation, no apology. The response came back quickly. Oh, okay. Nothing else. And in that nothing, I felt something subtle shift. Not tension, expectation. The unspoken assumption had been delayed. Not denied, just postponed. And that delay created space. Space for observation. Space for choice. Over the next few days, I paid attention. Not to my brother, specifically, but to myself. To the impulse to fill silence. To the discomfort that arose when I didn't immediately smooth things over. To the urge to justify restraint as politeness. I let the discomfort exist. That was new. I realized that the real change wasn't in how others treated me yet. It was in how quickly I intervened to maintain equilibrium. I had always believed that calm meant control, but I was beginning to see that restraint, real restraint, meant letting imbalance reveal itself. And an imbalance reveals a lot. Who notices? Who compensates? Who becomes uneasy when the familiar pattern isn't complete? That quiet evening didn't transform my life overnight, but it changed my position within it. I was no longer fully inside the role. I was standing just outside it, watching, waiting, and finally aware that I had a choice. Once I stopped reacting automatically, silence changed its meaning. Before, my silence had been passive. It filled the space left behind when I chose not to engage, not to correct, not to complicate. It was a default setting, something that happened because it felt easier than speaking. Now, it was deliberate. I didn't announce the change. I didn't explain myself. I simply began to pause where I used to comply, to listen without rushing to respond, to let questions hang unanswered a little longer than felt comfortable. At first, no one noticed. That's the thing about patterns. They don't trigger alarms until they're broken repeatedly. A single pause can be dismissed as a distraction. Two can be written off as mood. But over time, the absence of your usual response creates a vacuum, and vacuums invite attention. My brother noticed first. He didn't say anything outright. He didn't confront me. Instead, he filled the silence the way he always had. He spoke more, explained more, framed more. It was subtle, but I could see the effort behind it. Where I once would have nodded, I stayed neutral. Where I once would have clarified, I let ambiguity stand. Where I once would have stepped in, I waited. From the outside, it probably looked like disengagement. And that was fine, because disengagement is often mistaken for weakness, especially by people who are used to you doing the work quietly in the background. What changed was not how much I spoke, but when I chose to speak. I stopped offering unsolicited help. I stopped preemptively solving problems that hadn't been assigned to me. I responded to requests with timelines instead of immediacy. Boundaries, I learned, don't need justification to be real. The reactions were subtle, but consistent. A hint of impatience, a slight tightening of tone, a few jokes about me being busy lately. Nothing aggressive, nothing worth calling out, but it confirmed something important. My silence was no longer invisible. People had noticed, not consciously perhaps, but viscerally, that something they relied on was no longer automatic. And instead of asking why, they tested the old assumptions. Would I still step in if they waited long enough? Would I still smooth things over if tension lingered? Would I still explain myself if they implied confusion? I didn't, not out of spite, out of discipline. I was learning the difference between being calm and being compliant, between being helpful and being available by default, between peacekeeping and self-erasure. And the more I held that line, the clearer something became. My brother's narrative relied on my silence, but a predictable silence, the kind that allowed him to speak for me without resistance. Once silence became intentional, it stopped supporting his framing. So he adjusted. He started filling gaps more aggressively, clarifying my intentions before I had a chance to express them, casting my pauses as indecision. My neutrality is a form of disengagement. And still, I said nothing, because I was no longer trying to be understood in real time. I was observing. Silence, when chosen consciously, does something powerful. It removes the illusion of control from the person who expects you to respond on cue. It forces others to reveal how much they depend on your participation to maintain their version of events. I began to see how often my brother's confidence was reinforced by my compliance. How much of his authority came not from facts, but from unchallenged momentum. Without my immediate responses, that momentum wobbled. Not enough to collapse, just enough to expose its mechanics. People began misinterpreting my silence in new ways. Some assumed I didn't care. Some assumed I was overwhelmed. Some assumed I had lost interest. I let them, because none of those assumptions harmed me the way the old ones had. They didn't reduce my credibility. They didn't rewrite my history. They simply reflected uncertainty. And uncertainty, unlike misrepresentation, is temporary. I wasn't retreating. I was repositioning. What they saw as withdrawal was actually recalibration. What they interpreted as passivity was preparation. And while no one was watching closely enough to notice, I was gathering something far more valuable than validation. I was gathering clarity. While everyone else adjusted to my quieter presence, I was paying attention in a way I never had before. Not emotionally, structurally. When you stop participating automatically, you gain something rare: perspective. You begin to see patterns, not as experiences, but as systems. You notice who speaks first, who gets deferred to, who is protected by ambiguity, and who is exposed by it. Most importantly, you notice what people assume you're not doing. Because they had grown used to me being reactive, no one considered the possibility that I was documenting instead of responding, that I was observing instead of absorbing, that my silence wasn't empty, it was full. I didn't start preparing because I wanted revenge. I started because I wanted accuracy. I wanted to know whether what I felt had substance or whether I had misread everything. So I began keeping records. Nothing dramatic. No secret files or emotional journals. Just dates. Context. Direct quotes when possible. Screenshots of messages. Notes about who was present and how narratives shifted depending on the audience. At first, it felt excessive. But patterns don't reveal themselves through memory alone. Memory edits. Documentation doesn't. Over time, the picture became clearer. I saw how my brother's comments were never overtly false, but strategically framed. How he positioned himself as the interpreter of my intentions. How he spoke with certainty about my limits while remaining vague about his own. And I noticed something else. He rarely contradicted me directly. Instead, he spoke around me. He would establish a version of events before I arrived, or after I left. He would summarize my stance before I articulated it. And because I didn't challenge him in the moment, his version became the default. I wasn't just being misrepresented, I was being pre-framed. Once I understood that, I stopped trying to correct individual moments. That would have been inefficient and ineffective. You don't dismantle a structure by fixing cracks. You study its load-bearing points. I paid attention to how trust flowed, who relied on my brother's word, who checked facts independently, who valued calm certainty over nuance. I noticed that the people most influenced by his narrative weren't malicious or gullible. They were simply busy. They accepted the most confident explanation available because it saved time, and my silence had always made his explanations frictionless. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't just about family dynamics. It was about reputation economics. In any group, reputations function like shortcuts. They allow people to make decisions without reevaluating from scratch. And once a shortcut is established, it's rarely questioned unless it stops working. I began positioning myself differently, not by announcing change, but by aligning my actions with documentation. I followed through precisely on commitments. I reduced verbal explanations and increased written clarity. I made my contributions traceable, time-stamped and attributable. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was making ambiguity expensive. And because no one expected this shift from me, it went unnoticed. My brother continued as usual, speaking confidently, filling space, shaping perception, but now his framing had something to contend with. Consistency without commentary. I also started asking quieter questions, not challenges, clarifications. Can you point me to where that was decided? When did that understanding change? Who was included in that conversation? Neutral questions, no accusation, no heat. Questions that require accuracy. At first, they were answered casually, then defensively, then selectively. Each response added another data point, not just about facts, but about comfort levels. People reveal a lot when asked to be precise. What struck me most was how invisible all of this was to others. From the outside, I looked less engaged than ever. Fewer opinions, fewer reactions, less presence. But internally, I had never been more alert. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I wasn't building a case to win. I was ensuring that if something escalated, organically, inevitably, I wouldn't be relying on memory or emotion. I would be relying on records. This phase lasted longer than anyone would guess. Weeks passed, then months. No one grew suspicious because nothing seemed to be happening. And that's exactly why it worked. Preparation, when done quietly, doesn't announce itself. It waits. And during that waiting, something unexpected happened. The more I documented, the less personally affected I felt. Distance grew. Not emotional detachment, but clarity. I wasn't inside the story anymore. I was studying it. And once you step into that position, you stop asking whether you're being treated fairly. You start asking whether the structure can sustain itself. The moment of clarity didn't arrive with excitement. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of victory, no impulse to act immediately. When I finally saw the leverage clearly, what I felt was quiet stillness. Almost disappointment at how predictable it all was. It happened while I was reviewing everything I had collected over time. Messages, notes, timelines, repeated patterns laid out side by side. When viewed individually, none of it looked alarming. But together, the shape was undeniable. My brother wasn't just shaping how people saw me. He was protecting how people saw him, and he was doing it by contrast. I noticed how often his stories placed him as the responsible one, the decisive one, the interpreter. How my role in those same stories was consistently passive, supportive but secondary. Never wrong enough to be dismissed outright, just limited enough to never compete. That distinction mattered, because it meant his narrative depended on mine remaining small. What I also noticed, what shifted everything, was inconsistency. In private communication, his language was careful. Requests framed as favors, acknowledgements of my competence, occasional deference when he needed something done well. In public, that tone changed. My abilities became conditional. My intentions are simplified. My decisions softened into indecision. The contrast wasn't accidental, it was contextual. And context is where leverage lives. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with narrative management. Not malicious in a cinematic sense. No grand scheme, just a repeated habit of positioning that had become efficient over time. It worked because it was subtle, and because I had never contested it. But now, I had something different. I had alignment between facts and records. I could trace where statements diverged, where summaries contradicted written communication, where implications didn't match outcomes. I could see how certain claims relied on my silence to remain plausible. And I understood something else. Leverage doesn't mean exposure. It means an option. I didn't need to confront them. I didn't need to show anyone what I had. Power wasn't in using it. It was in knowing that the story could no longer be controlled by one voice alone. That realization changed how I felt immediately. Not superior, not vindicated, just settled. For the first time, I wasn't uncertain about whether I was imagining things. I wasn't second-guessing my reactions. I wasn't wondering if I had overinterpreted harmless behavior. The pattern was real, and because it was real, it didn't require emotional energy anymore. I remember sitting back after reviewing everything, closing my laptop, and doing nothing for a long time. No planning, no next steps, just letting the understanding exist. That pause mattered, because when people discover leverage too early, they rush to use it. They confuse clarity with urgency. They turn awareness into reaction and lose the advantage of restraint. I didn't want that. I wasn't interested in winning an argument. I was interested in exiting a system that depended on my reduction. So I asked myself a different question. What can I do now? But what am I no longer obligated to do? The answer was immediate. I was no longer obligated to protect a narrative that diminished me. I was no longer obligated to fill gaps that others exploited. I was no longer obligated to explain myself to people who weren't listening. And most importantly, I was no longer obligated to act before I was ready. That's when I understood the nature of the leverage I held. It wasn't a secret weapon. It wasn't a dramatic reveal. It was timing. I could choose when or if the truth entered the room. And until that moment came, I could continue exactly as I was, calm, quiet, and fully aware of the structure around me. Nothing had changed externally, but internally the uncertainty was gone. And once uncertainty disappears, everything else becomes a matter of choice, not reaction. Once I understood what I had, I reached a point I couldn't avoid anymore. Not a crisis, a decision. Up until then, everything I had done was reversible. I could return to silence. I could re-enter the old role. I could pretend I'd never noticed the pattern at all. Awareness on its own doesn't force action, but it does force choice. I saw 3 paths clearly. The first was to confront my brother directly, lay everything out, ask for honesty, demand accountability. It was the most emotionally satisfying option. The one people expect when wrongdoing is discovered, but it relied on something I no longer trusted: good faith. A direct confrontation would turn this into a debate about intent, tone, and memory. He could deny, reframe, apologize vaguely, or accuse me of misreading the situation. Even if he acknowledged part of it, the narrative would shift again, this time casting me as overly sensitive or resentful. The structure would remain intact. The second option was exposure. I could show others what I had documented, let facts speak, correct the record publicly and decisively. It would be effective. It would also be destructive, not just to him, but to relationships that didn't deserve to be collateral damage. People don't like discovering they've been misled. Even when presented with evidence, they often resent the messenger. I wasn't interested in replacing one distorted narrative with another, this time centered on conflict. Then there was the third option: exit the role, not physically, not dramatically, but structurally. Stop participating in the system that allowed the misrepresentation to function. Remove myself as a variable that could be shaped, summarized, or spoken for. Let the narrative lose its foundation quietly. This option felt slower, less satisfying, irreversible in a way the others weren't. Because once you stop performing a role, you don't get to step back into it without cost. I thought about what I wanted long term, not in terms of winning, but in terms of peace. Real peace, the kind that doesn't depend on someone else behaving better. And the answer was clear. I chose the option that didn't require anyone else to change. That choice didn't happen in a single moment. It settled gradually, like a decision your body has already made before your mind catches up. I stopped explaining my absence from conversations. I stopped volunteering context. I stopped positioning myself for approval. I began redirecting my energy elsewhere. I limited how much access my brother had to my time, my work, my internal processes. I kept communication factual and minimal, not cold, just contained. This wasn't punishment. It was a withdrawal. And withdrawal is powerful because it doesn't provoke defense. It creates uncertainty. Without my participation, his narrative lost something essential. It could still exist, but it couldn't move. It couldn't adapt in real time. It couldn't be reinforced through my reactions. I also made one quiet, irreversible adjustment. I aligned my external commitments, work, collaborations, long-term plans, in ways that didn't intersect with him at all. No shared responsibilities, no overlapping expectations, no reliance. Once done, it couldn't be undone without deliberate effort from both sides. That was the point. The day I finalized that shift, nothing happened. No message, no tension, no fallout. And yet something fundamental had changed. I had removed myself from the story he was telling. From that moment on, any version of me he described would exist without my reinforcement. It would age without updates. And outdated narratives don't survive long in environments that value results. This choice didn't give me control over what others believed. It gave me control over what I participated in. And that distinction made all the difference. Once the decision was made, the most difficult part wasn't acting. It was not being seen. We're conditioned to believe that change should be visible, that progress announces itself through statements, explanations, or confrontations. But the kind of shift I was making required the opposite. It required continuity on the surface and divergence underneath. So I moved quietly. I didn't withdraw suddenly. I didn't decline everything. I became selective in ways that were hard to quantify. My availability changed gradually. My involvement narrowed. I redirected effort toward things that left clear trails, contracts, deliverables, and written agreements. At work, I began formalizing everything I used to handle informally. Decisions that once happened verbally were summarized in writing. Contributions that once blended into the background were documented clearly. I didn't demand recognition. I made attribution unavoidable. No one objected. Why would they? Clarity benefits everyone, until it limits flexibility. And at this stage, it still looked like efficiency. In family contexts, I did something similar. I stopped arriving early to fix things before anyone noticed. I stopped staying late to smooth over unresolved tension. I participated, but I didn't manage. If someone asked for my opinion, I gave it plainly and briefly. If someone spoke for me, I didn't correct them immediately. I followed up later, with facts, not emotion. This confused people more than open disagreement would have. Confusion is disorienting because it doesn't offer a clear opponent. My brother especially seemed unsettled by the lack of friction. He tried to engage me the old way, casual requests, assumed access, shared history as leverage. I met all of it with consistency, no defensiveness, no explanations, no emotional cues, just limits. What he couldn't see, and what no one else noticed, was how thoroughly I was restructuring my position. I renegotiated responsibilities at work so nothing essential depended on me, quietly compensating for others. I clarified boundaries in writing. I declined temporary overlaps that had a habit of becoming permanent. Each change was small, Together, they were decisive. I also stopped correcting misconceptions unless they had direct consequences. If someone believed I was less involved, less ambitious, less central, that was fine. Those beliefs only mattered if they affected outcomes. And increasingly, they didn't, because outcomes were now traceable. Deliverables had names attached. Timelines had owners. Decisions had records. The system no longer relied on impressions. It relied on proof. That shift happened beneath the surface. No one commented on it. No one resisted it. It simply became how things were done, which is why it worked. The most telling sign that I was doing this correctly was how little reaction there was. People resist what they perceive as loss. They don't resist what they don't notice. My brother's narrative still existed, but it no longer had leverage over my position. It could color opinions, but it couldn't redirect outcomes. I was no longer in competition. I was operating in parallel. And when systems operate in parallel, the one grounded in structure eventually outpaces the one grounded in perception. Still, nothing seemed to be happening. From the outside, I looked quieter than ever, less engaged, more distant. The kind of person people stop watching closely. That invisibility once imposed was now chosen, and choice changes everything. Because while no one was paying attention, the conditions that allowed my reputation to be shaped without resistance were disappearing. One quiet adjustment at a time. The consequences didn't have an impact. They arrived as an absence. At first, it showed up in small, almost invisible ways. A delay where there used to be immediacy. A task that went unfinished longer than expected. A question that lingered because no one stepped in to resolve it automatically. People noticed, but they didn't understand. Because when something has always functioned quietly in the background, its disappearance doesn't trigger an alarm. It triggers confusion. A vague sense that something feels slower, heavier, less coordinated than before. And confusion rarely points to a source. My brother felt it before anyone else. He began following up more often, asking questions that assumed context I no longer provided, referencing past patterns that no longer apply. There was a subtle urgency in his tone, nothing overt, just a pressure that hadn't been there before. The system he was used to was still there on the surface, but it wasn't responding. Where I once would have anticipated needs, I now waited for clarity. Where I once would have filled gaps, I now leave them visible. And those gaps made people uncomfortable. Not because they were large, but because they revealed dependency. I watched this unfold without satisfaction, because this wasn't a collapse. It was exposure. Others began compensating in ways I hadn't seen before, stepping into roles they hadn't realized I'd been carrying, negotiating responsibilities that used to default to me, asking questions that had always been answered quietly in advance. No one accused me of withdrawing. They simply adjusted, awkwardly, inefficiently at first. That adjustment was the consequence, not punishment, not retaliation, just reality redistributing itself. My brother's narrative also began to strain. Without my quiet cooperation, his framing required more effort. He had to explain more, justify more, fill more space. And the more he did, the more noticeable it became. People started asking follow-up questions, not because they distrusted him, but because the environment had changed. The shortcuts he relied on no longer led cleanly to outcomes. And shortcuts, when they stop working, draw attention. I noticed a shift in how people interacted with me. Not admiration, not an apology, recalibration. They began addressing me directly again, asking for confirmation instead of accepting summaries, waiting for my response instead of assuming it. The role I had exited left a vacancy, and vacancies force reassessment. What struck me most was how little emotion accompanied this phase. No one was angry, no one felt betrayed. There were no dramatic realizations, just a mild inconvenience. But mild inconvenience is powerful. It's often the first signal that a system is relying on something unsustainable. My brother, sensing this, tried to reestablish familiarity. He reached out more often, suggested collaboration, referred to shared history. The tone was warmer, but also more deliberate. He needed access again, and that told me everything, because access had always been the currency. Access to my reliability, access to my silence, access to my willingness to smooth things over. Without it, his position required more work. I didn't deny him outright. I simply maintained the structure I had put in place. Clear boundaries, defined scope, written follow-ups. Nothing he could object to without revealing the dependency itself. That's when I understood the nature of the consequence I had set in motion. It wasn't a visible loss. It was an invisible effort. Others had to work harder where they hadn't before. And that effort made the old assumptions inconvenient to maintain. I didn't need anyone to realize what had happened. I just needed the system to stop relying on me without acknowledgement. And it was, quietly. By the time anyone tried to fix things, the structure had already shifted. That's the thing about quiet changes. They don't announce themselves when they're happening. They only become visible once reversal requires effort. And effort is where hesitation begins. The first signs weren't confrontational. They came as check-ins, casual messages, indirect questions, invitations framed as reconnection rather than necessity. My brother reached out with a tone that was unfamiliar, careful, measured, almost tentative. "Everything okay? You've been a bit distant lately?" Just checking in. On the surface, it sounded concerned. Underneath, it was diagnostic. He wasn't asking how I felt. He was trying to determine whether the system could be restored without friction. I answered politely, briefly, honestly. "Yes, I'm fine. Just busy with other priorities." Nothing wrong, because there wasn't. The discomfort wasn't mine. As weeks passed, the tone shifted again. Less warmth, more urgency. Conversations that once drifted now circled specific outcomes. Requests became clearer, more pointed. He tried to re-establish old rhythms, shared planning, assumed coordination. But those rhythms depended on access I had already closed. Not dramatically, structurally. At some point, he tried something different. He apologized. Not for anything specific, not with acknowledgement. Just a general expression of regret. Vague enough to avoid responsibility. Emotional enough to invite reconciliation. It was the kind of apology that works when the other person is eager to return to normal. I wasn't, because normal was what allowed everything to happen quietly in the first place. I thanked him, I accepted the sentiment, and I didn't change anything. That's when confusion set in. You can feel it when someone realizes that emotional gestures no longer move the system. That access, once taken for granted, now requires negotiation. And negotiation feels like a loss to people who are used to assumptions. He tried to involve others, not directly, never directly, but through suggestion, through implication, through shared concern. "She seems different lately. I'm not sure what's going on with him. I hope everything's okay." But this time the response was muted, because the environment had changed. People were already adapting to new realities. They had begun interacting with me directly again. They had experienced the consequences of the old shortcuts failing. There was no appetite for drama, only adjustment. The opportunity for narrative repair had passed. What I realized then was something important. Fixing this would have required acknowledgement before the structure shifted. It would have required recognition of my agency when it still mattered. Once the system recalibrated, returning to old roles would have felt regressive to everyone involved. Too much had changed, not emotionally, operationally. And operational changes don't respond to apologies. They respond to incentives. The incentives were gone. My brother sensed it. I could see it in the way his communication became inconsistent, sometimes overly formal, sometimes trying to slip back into familiarity. He was testing for cracks. There weren't any, not because I had built walls, but because I had built alignment. My actions matched my boundaries. My availability matched my priorities. My responses matched my intentions. Nothing contradicted itself. And that consistency made reversal impossible without confrontation, which he avoided, because confrontation would have forced him to articulate something he couldn't. A clear explanation for why my silence was suddenly a problem. It wasn't. It was simply no longer useful. The panic, when it came, was quiet. A realization that something essential had been lost, not through conflict, but through neglect. That restoring it would require admission, not adjustment. And admission has a cost. By the time that cost became clear, it was already too late. The system had moved on, and so had I. The conversation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly calm. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic reveal. It took place in a neutral space, a quiet cafe, mid-afternoon. Not a family gathering, not a private home. Somewhere public enough to discourage intensity, but quiet enough to allow honesty, if it appeared. My brother suggested a meeting. I agreed. When he arrived, he looked composed, but alert. The way people do when they sense a shift they didn't initiate. We exchanged small talk, nothing strained, nothing warm. Then he asked, directly, "What changed?" Not why, not what did I do, just what changed. I paused before answering, not for effect, but to choose accuracy over explanation. I stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine, I said. That was it. No history lesson, no list of grievances, no emotional framing. He frowned slightly, processing. "I don't really understand," he replied. "It feels like you pulled away." "I didn't pull away," I said. I stepped back into my own lane. That landed differently. He tried to reframe it, suggested stress, miscommunication, timing. He spoke carefully, as if trying to locate a version of the problem that could be solved without responsibility. I let him. Then I said something that shifted the tone, not emotionally, but structurally. "I'm not asking you to agree with my perception," I said. "I'm just letting you know how I'm operating now." That removed the argument entirely. There was nothing to debate. I wasn't asking for validation. I wasn't demanding acknowledgement. I wasn't seeking repair. I was informing him of a boundary that already existed. He asked if we could reset things. I considered the question honestly. "Reset implies returning to a version that worked," I said. That version worked for everyone except me. Silence followed. Not hostile, reflective. I didn't accuse him of ruining my reputation. I didn't present evidence. I didn't expose contradictions. I didn't need to, because this conversation wasn't about the past. It was about access going forward. He realized that. I could see it in the way his posture shifted. Not defensive, but resigned. He asked fewer questions, offered fewer explanations. He was recalculating. Eventually he nodded. "I didn't realize you felt that way," he said. I accepted that without commentary. Not because it resolved anything, but because resolution wasn't the goal. Clarity was. We finished our coffee. The conversation drifted back to neutral topics. Logistics, surface level updates, no tension, no warmth. When we stood to leave, there was no promise to do better, no agreement to change, no dramatic conclusion. Just a mutual understanding that something fundamental had already shifted and wouldn't be undone by conversation. As I walked away, I felt nothing close to triumph. What I felt was relief, because confrontation, when stripped of emotion, reveals something important. Whether the other person wants understanding or access. And I had already answered that question through action. The conversation didn't change my path. It confirmed it. Who I am now looks very similar to who I was before, at least on the surface. I'm still quiet, still measured, still more comfortable observing than performing. I didn't reinvent myself. I didn't become louder, sharper, or more aggressive. I didn't replace silence with dominance in the way people usually imagine it. What changed wasn't my personality. It was my position. I no longer confuse calm with consent. I no longer equate reliability with obligation. I no longer offer access without intention. These shifts are subtle, but they're structural. They shape how I move through the world, how I respond to requests, and how I evaluate relationships. And because they're consistent, they don't require explanation. People sense them. At work, my role is clearer now. Not larger, clearer. Expectations are defined. Contributions are traceable. I'm respected not because I assert myself, but because I operate with precision. There's less ambiguity about what I do and don't own. That clarity has brought something unexpected. Freedom. When you're no longer compensating for unspoken expectations, your energy returns. You stop managing perceptions and start managing outcomes. You don't need to correct misunderstandings because you've stopped feeding them. In my family, the dynamic has settled into something quieter. There's distance, but not hostility. Fewer assumptions, more formality, fewer attempts to interpret my intentions. That might sound colder, but it's actually cleaner. There's less friction because there's less overreach. I'm no longer the stabilizer. And the system didn't collapse. That was an important lesson. The world doesn't fall apart when you stop playing the role assigned to you. It reorganizes, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes inefficiently, but it adapts. And adaptation is healthier than dependency. I don't feel anger toward my brother, not because what happened didn't matter, but because I understand it now. His behavior didn't come from malice. It came from habit, from unchecked authority, from a dynamic that benefited him without requiring intention. Understanding that doesn't excuse it, but it frees me from carrying it. The most meaningful change is internal. I trust my perceptions now. I don't second-guess discomfort. I don't wait for clarity to arrive on its own. I treat patterns as information, not emotions to suppress. And when something feels off, I don't rush to fix it. I observe it. That's quite dominance. Not control over others, but control over participation. The ability to choose where your energy goes, where your voice is necessary, and where silence is strategic. I haven't reclaimed my reputation through exposure or confrontation. I've done it by becoming unambiguous. The version of me that exists now doesn't need defending because it's not constructed through commentary. It's constructed through consistency. People interact with what's in front of them. And what's in front of them now is someone who is present by choice, not obligation. I didn't lose anything in this process. I shed something. And what remains is lighter, clearer, and finally aligned. This story doesn't end with justice served in a dramatic way. There was no moment where everyone suddenly understood what had happened. No public acknowledgement. No apology that rewrote the past. And I'm okay with that, because clarity doesn't need applause to be real. What I learned through all of this is simple, but not easy. Silence is not weakness, but unchosen silence becomes permission. For a long time, I believed that staying calm meant staying safe, that avoiding conflict meant protecting relationships, that being reliable would eventually lead to being respected. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes reliability without boundaries turns into invisibility, and invisibility invites misrepresentation. The most dangerous narratives aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet ones that go unchallenged long enough to feel factual. They form not because someone is malicious, but because no one interrupts them early. I also learned that you don't have to expose someone to reclaim yourself. You don't need revenge. You don't need validation. You don't need to correct every misunderstanding. You just need to stop participating in systems that depend on your silence to function. When you do that, things change naturally. Not emotionally, but structurally. People adjust, roles shift, narratives lose traction when they no longer produce results. That kind of change doesn't feel satisfying in the moment. It feels lonely, quiet, uncertain. But over time, it creates something far more stable than vindication, peace without erasure. If you're listening to this and recognizing parts of your own life, being underestimated, being spoken for, being quietly reduced, I want you to know this. You're not obligated to correct every lie. You're not required to defend yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. And you don't need to become louder to become clearer. Sometimes the most powerful move is to step back, document, realign, and let the structure reveal itself. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about choice. Choice over where you invest your energy. Choice over which narratives you reinforce. Choice over when silence is a shield and when it's a signal. Nothing in this story happened overnight, and nothing was fixed all at once. But by choosing alignment over reaction, I reclaimed something that mattered far more than my reputation. I reclaimed authorship, and that's what I hope you take from this. Not a strategy, not a template, but a reminder that your story doesn't belong to whoever speaks the loudest. It belongs to whoever lives it with intention. So I'll leave you with one question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that staying quiet was costing you more than speaking up ever could?